And I know that the world's eyes are on the UK for the COP26 Climate Change Conference. And indeed, I know that there are many, many members in this House that wanted to contribute to this debate today, but they too are at the COP26 Climate Change Conference, very much, I'm sure, making these arguments directly in those halls. I also know that tackling climate change can sometimes feel like such an enormous and challenging task that we just don't know where to start. It can also feel a little too abstract to cut through the day-to-day concerns that people face about their jobs and about the cost of living. So in introducing this important petition today, I wanted to start with a reminder that whilst meeting our climate goals is certainly challenging, it is also very achievable. Thanks to the work of the Committee on Climate Change, we can also put some concrete figures on the cost of the transition. The committee estimates that we must raise investment in low-carbon technology by around £50 billion per year over the next 10 years, and most of that will come from the private sector, and it will go towards meeting the government's 2050 target. It sounds like a lot, and government will need to take the lead on it, but it works out at less than 1% of GDP over the next 30 years, around an eighth of the current annual investment. And as the government's net zero review consistently points out, the upfront cost of meeting the net zero target is dwarfed by the costs of not acting. Government and Parliament have committed to this transition. It has been legislated for, and it must happen. So we know the costs of achieving net zero are manageable with the right support. We also know, however, that the impact of the transition won't be felt equally across the economy or society. And because of the confusing array of climate policies currently in place in this country, it can be difficult to determine where the impact will be felt and to what extent. There is therefore a great deal of uncertainty, not just around the development and impact of low-carbon technologies, but also on how to design policies and the unequal effect that they will have on sectors and households. Carbon emissions and the climate change that they cause are a classic example of market failure. Individuals and businesses do not face the full costs of emissions that they create, and so, all else being equal, we would expect them to emit more than is optimal for society. For some time, economists have therefore argued that the answer is to put a price on emitting greenhouse gases, so individual firms do face the full cost of their choices. In its simplest terms, this petition's call is for the government to work towards a single carbon price across almost all sectors. The campaign argues that a single carbon price would amalgamate the many existing price instruments, including the carbon price support and the UK emissions trading scheme, a different form of carbon charging, into a simple, transparent carbon charge. Zero Carbon point out that our current policies only cover emissions across about a third of the economy, giving the biggest polluters free allowances, while consumers are left to pay. And I pay tribute to the petition's creator, Isabella Goldstein, the senior campaign manager at Zero Carbon Campaign. The theory behind the form of carbon charging is straightforward. If we had a single carbon price of £75 per tonne of CO2, for example, that would incentivise people and businesses to pursue any methods of emission reduction that cost less than £75. Honourable members will be aware that we are far from having a single carbon price across sectors. Instead, we have a patchwork of policies that incentivise or disincentivise emissions in ways that are often unclear. While they do have the overall effect of discouraging the burning of fossil fuels, for example, the cost varies hugely depending on the source of emissions. The key benefit of working towards a uniform carbon price, it's argued, would be that it avoids a situation where some sectors face higher carbon prices and must therefore make more expensive carbon reductions, while others could more easily and cheaply reduce their emissions, but they do not. So to be successful, a carbon charge must of course be accompanied by extensive investment in low carbon technologies, and the state, the government, would have to lead on that. But it would by and large leave businesses and households to decide how best to reduce their emissions in the most efficient way possible. And it wouldn't affect an impact on everyone equally. However, I know that petitioners do not advocate a purely market-based approach. When I spoke to Hannah Dillon, head of campaign at Zero Carbon, one of her biggest concerns was that we design policies to tackle climate change in a fair and equitable way. But it's not just about the principled argument for fairness. Ensuring the most adversely affected are supported is also crucial for maintaining public and political support for net zero. An obvious answer to this is that charges aimed at tackling climate change would also raise revenue, and these revenues could be used to compensate the groups that are most adversely affected. However we address this issue, it's essential that the government set a clear path for policy and introduce support through our social welfare system to give households and businesses that time to adjust. This is a complex and difficult policy area, and it will have huge impact on our living standards for decades to come. So decisions must be taken with care and subject to proper scrutiny, but we all must accept the urgency of the climate crisis and the need to take action as soon as possible. Another key challenge relates to the emissions embedded in imports. In line with international practice, emissions in imported products are simply ignored for the purposes of our climate targets. And research from the World Wildlife Fund suggests that almost half of the UK's emissions come from this source. So in theory, we could reach net zero on paper, even if our consumption on imported goods led to a higher level of global emissions. And I know that lead petitioners have called on the government to address this issue with carbon border adjustments, ensuring there's a price to pay for carbon-intensive imports, and shielding UK competitors who do not face equivalent charges. And I know this is something that the EU are working on. It will take some years to implement, but some form of carbon adjustment at the border, without it, there's a danger that the UK climate policies could simply drive industry to locations with fewer restrictions, increase carbon-intensive imports to the UK, and ultimately increase global emissions. So before I conclude, I want to ask the Minister a specific question on the UK emissions trading scheme. The government previously said it would consult on the implementation of a net zero consistent cap for UK emissions trading scheme. We know it's supposed to happen this year, and it was referenced in the government's net zero strategy, but details on the timescales have been a bit vague. So could I ask the Minister, when she responds, to tell us when this review is going to happen? So to conclude, Chair, all eyes are on the UK for the COP26 conference. The planet cannot wait, and this petition has underlined the need for action in 3 key areas. First, we need to facilitate the shift to low-carbon alternatives within households and ensure businesses take responsibility for the emissions they produce. Secondly, we must protect those most vulnerable to the unequal impact of climate policies. If we don't do this, not only will the outcome be regressive, but it will also undermine public support for the transition to net zero. Finally, we must take measures to stop carbon leakage. It would be catastrophic if we were to achieve net zero domestically at the expense of triggering a carbon-intensive import boom. This is our time to show that this country will lead, not lag, in the global fight against climate change. And I, for one, and I am joined by over 100,000 petitioners today, hope that we take it.
The question is that this House has considered E-petition 574678 relating to charges on carbon emissions. Jeremy Mayhew.
Thank you, Mr Robertson. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and to follow the speech of the Honourable Member for Newcastle upon Tyne North. the contents of which I very substantially agree with. And it's a wonderful thing about this debate that it stretches across the divide that so often separates the views of people in this House. But I approach the matter from a slightly different perspective, albeit arriving at similar conclusions, because I see this as the role of the free market. And as a former businessman and entrepreneur, I want to unleash the power of the free market to help solve some of the problems which its historic performance has helped to create. Because too often, Mr. Chairman, the market has been seen as the villain. We talk about business profiteering at the expense of the environment, or of the businesses trashing the world's resources, not just in carbon net zero and greenhouse gases, but also in the use of our biodiversity, as highlighted by the report of Professor Dasgupta earlier on this year, where he said, just in terms of the biosphere, that our current practices were using the resources of 1.6 worlds. So it is true that the market, historically, has been almost totally blind to the cost of carbon in its economic transactions. So when I buy a product like this glass here, I pay for the raw materials, I pay for the design process, the manufacturing, the marketing, the transport, and the profit. But what I don't pay for is the cost of the carbon emission, because it's described as an externality. It dissipates into the atmosphere, and there is no significant cost attached to it. And the result of that misallocation of resources is that the transaction is incomplete. As a purchaser, I'm not having a true economic exchange with the supplier, because I'm only paying for part of the product, not all of it. And as a result, there is no signal for consumers to look at two separate products and identify the differential cost between the manufacturing process of a high-carbon glass and a low-carbon glass. We are blind as consumers. So all those myriad consumer decisions that we take in our economy every day are ineffective in helping to give a signal to manufacturers. So there's no signal through the process to consumers, and as a result, the consumers in their turn do not provide a clear market signal to entrepreneurs and businesses. And so what are we left with? Well, we all know at the governmental level that this is a huge problem, the climate change crisis. And so we have plans from government. We have government picking technology winners, investing in hydrogen, which I hope is going to be a key part of the solution for our net zero progress towards 2050. But it might not be. And the real problem we have is we're relying on the government to take these kind of decisions currently, because the market is very substantially blind, and we need to unleash its power through a price for carbon. Because what we do know about markets is that they are, without question, the most efficient decider of the use of resources that man has ever come up with. And they do that not for moral reasons, but for wholly personal reasons. They wish to maximize profits. And the way you maximize profits is you minimize the inputs. So properly directed by market signals, the market is the most efficient resource user that we can come up with. It also informs millions of decisions, as I previously mentioned, and crucially, the market and its myriad transactions creates the wealth, the individual wealth, which can go on to fund the additional government action that the market on itself is unable to provide. Because whilst I'm a free marketeer, I'm not a free marketeer red in tooth and claw. There is absolutely a role for government to set the structures and to give the long-term signals for the free market, and also to provide assistance and support for those left behind parts of our community that otherwise would be disadvantaged by that process. But the biggest challenge we have in creating a price for carbon is that the United Kingdom economy is not self-contained. We're part of a global economy. So if we raise the price of carbon in this country, which is really another name for increasing the price of energy, then that has a very direct and immediate risk to our domestic economy, particularly our manufacturing base. What happens is that the price of energy is raised in your domestic economy, increasing the cost of your domestic manufacturing base. It either offshores, relocates to a lower cost environment abroad, or it doesn't, and it gets undermined by sucking in lower cost, higher carbon imports, which results in the worst of all worlds, which is a destruction of your own economic base and an actual increase in greenhouse gas emissions as we add in transport costs as well as the cost of production. And so we have, as a result, as an economy, we've been very timid in our approach to applying a cost of carbon. We do in some sectors. About a third of our manufacturing base is affected in some way by carbon pricing through the ETS scheme. But that's just a third. There are 2/3 of our manufacturing base which has no carbon pricing attached to it at all, and none of the imports into this country are assessed or priced for their carbon content. So how do we address this seemingly impossible conundrum? The answer, in principle, is actually quite simple, and it's a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And what that means is that at the edge of your economy, when you have imports reach your border, you assess those products for the carbon content and apply a similar approach to their carbon content, applying a similar price through a tariff as you do on the domestic market. This is not protectionist in principle because it's applying a same price. It's creating a level playing field as opposed to disadvantaging exports in favour of your domestic manufacturing. It must be transparent, and it must be within the permissible exceptions of the World Trade Organization. There is an exception to allow for tariffs in environmental cases. What this does is it allows you to increase the price of carbon, in principle, for your domestic market, safe in the knowledge that imports will have the similar price attached to them. There's been quite a lot of work done by think tanks and others, and I understand and I hope by the Treasury as well and BEIS, to look into how you could start applying this in practice, because it's a very simple process conceptually, but has the potential to be fiendishly difficult to apply. And if you can do it, the benefits are enormous because it will incentivize the reduced carbon manufacturing processes that we're all looking to achieve in this country because of the market signals, but its benefits expand beyond our borders. Because if you're a manufacturer in a third country, let's say, for example, China, and you export your product to the United Kingdom, you will not want to receive a significant tariff addition to the price of your product. And the Chinese government, or any other third-party government, has a choice. They can think to themselves, well, we can either have a tariff applied to our exports, which then gets paid to the UK Treasury, or we can apply a similar process ourselves and keep the money here within China. The third option is they can reduce the 70 to 80% reliance they have on coal for their energy and reduce the differential between their carbon production and our own. All these are very positive international signals that we can spread beyond our borders through the imposition of a CBAM. And there's evidence that this is already working. Mr. Chairman, you'll be aware that the European Union published on the 15th of July a draft bill to implement a carbon border adjustment mechanism throughout the European Union. And even before that has come to fruition, and it's just at draft stage, there's evidence that automobile manufacturers in South Africa are already looking to increase the decrease the carbon content of their manufacturing process because they're concerned that they will be adversely affected by the imposition of a CBAM in the European Union. So even the publishing of a bill, a draft bill, is already having real-world positive impacts on the reduction of carbon. And another advantage that it can provide is the potential for a reshoring of manufacturing production to the United Kingdom. Because what it does is it removes one of the current disincentives for high energy or relatively high energy production in this country, because we do have a price for carbon through the ETS, not one that is sufficiently significant to change consumer behaviour on a more widespread basis, which we want it to do, but enough to provide a minor disincentive to have manufacturing in this country. And if we can remove that disincentive, then it will encourage reshoring. And there's been evidence, or rather a research undertaken by, I think it was Capital Economics, which looked into the steel industry in the United Kingdom and concluded that steel manufacturing would be, its international competitiveness would actually be increased by the imposition of a carbon border adjustment mechanism of between £50 and £75 per tonne through the 2020s. So we have, Mr. Chairman, in my submission, a political opportunity now, not just with the advent of COP26, but more significantly, perhaps, with the drafting of the bill by the European Union, the publishing of it, because it gives us an opportunity to address one of the key challenges to a CBAM, which is how do you deal with the concern, stroke disapproval of large exporting countries who have a high carbon input, for instance, China. We have an opportunity with the European Union to join forces and have a more internationalist approach to the introduction of a CBAM now. It wouldn't hurt, dipping into another language, where we have a certain froideur across the channel currently, and sticking the same approach. What about a bit of rapprochement, where we have a joint, there's a joint objective here, which allows us, with Brexit, we're allowed to be nimble of foot. We can come up with these policies ourselves. We're not held back by a pan-European approach. Equally, it doesn't prevent us from agreeing and cooperating with the European Union when it's in our national interests. And I think this is a great example where our national interests and those of the European Union coincide very neatly. And it gives us an opportunity to build bridges, should we wish to do so. It also helps us in the potential approach to China, in that it's the entire European market that is taking this, or potentially taking this approach, and as well as the United States of America, who has expressed increasing interest in the concept of some form of carbon border adjustment mechanism. I mentioned earlier that CBAMs are simple in principle and hard to apply in practice. I am agnostic as to how we do it. There are many different approaches which have been suggested. We could expand on the current ETS scheme. We could, as Mr. Carney has suggested, take the 5 key products which are internationally traded, so that would be steel, cement, aluminium, chemicals, and so forth, and start on that basis and then build out into the wider economy as we gain confidence and competence in the process of a CBAM. Or we could apply it by sector assessments by country, which would be more of a purist approach, but much more complex to apply. I suspect, Mr. Chairman, that the answer is to start small and to grow as we learn. But the sooner we start, the better. And I've concluded my speech by challenging anyone to come up with a way in which we can impose a price for carbon without some form of carbon border adjustment mechanism.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr Robertson. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'd like to congratulate the petitioners for bringing forward this petition, and for Honourable Member for Newcastle-on-Tyne, how she presented the debate and the key points. It's certainly a very worthwhile time to be debating this, given, as was said, we've got COP26 going on in Glasgow as we speak, and certainly how we achieve net zero in the fairest way is something that needs serious discussions. As a slight disappointment, there wasn't more backbench contributions tonight, but so be it. I completely agree with the Honourable Member for Newcastle-on-Tyne's 3 key points about, obviously, we need to generate a shift to low-carbon technologies, but it's really critical we protect the most vulnerable, and we need to stop the carbon leakage, and that was certainly a point continued by the Honourable Member for Broadland. The Honourable Member for Broadland made an interesting contribution. I was trying to summarise it where I think he said he's an absolute proud free marketeer, but he's not really a free marketeer because there's interventions that they need to be taken. So it's quite an interesting dynamic and very much a protectionist on imported goods, it seems. But again, for the right reasons, because we're talking about carbon border adjustments. But yeah, carry on.
I'm grateful for the Honourable Member for giving way. I want to make absolutely clear I'm not protectionist. It's very important. If a CBAM is to be successful, that we ban the P word, it has to be apply exactly the same level of tariff as you do to your domestic economy.
Thank you for that intervention. It's possible I was being slightly flippant when I used the protectionist word, because I also take his point about, really, if we're going to do this correctly, it's got to be collaboration with other countries and, you know, and work that way. So I do agree with that. So, Mr Robertson, it does seem, if we believe in the basic principle that the polluter pays, then a carbon tax does make sense. And if we're serious about achieving net zero, then we need to give serious consideration to carbon taxes. But as has already been said, and I said in my opening remarks, any such taxation needs to have a fairness to it. It can't be structured in such a way that companies feel obliged or rewarded for relocating to other countries, therefore defeating the purpose. But critically, it must also have a fairness and not lead to the poorer in society paying effectively a bigger burden, especially, for example, if a tax is levied in gas bills. The reality is that those more affluent are going to be able to switch to heat pumps, for example, going forward, but those struggling to pay their energy bills as it is have no chance of doing so. So therefore, we can't leave the most vulnerable to pick up the carbon tab for others as we transition the energy sector to net zero. If we look at the recent government policy of the £5,000 grant for heat pumps, well, that's still insufficient, actually, for most people to be able to afford a new installation of a heat pump. The unit cost of a heat pump still, Mr Robertson, in the price range is £6,000 to £10,000. So a £5,000 grant only goes part of the way, but it doesn't make up for all the additional work that's also required. Need to have proper energy efficiency measures, which are welcome but cost money, a new water tank, possibly new radiators, decommission the boiler, and then there's decoration works that needs done to property once all that work's completed. So therefore that £5,000 grant clearly isn't a pathway to increase the number of heat pump installations from what's a current figure of 30,000 installs per year to the government target of £600,000 a year. So going forward, we need to look at that in the mix. And if a carbon tax is introduced, we need to make sure there's not more fuel poor created. And actually, how do we use these revenues from the carbon tax to actually help those get their heat pumps and energy efficiency measures for those that need it the most? And there is a reality at the moment, the way the power sector decarbonisation has been paid for, it's paid for by levies on our electricity bills. Now, the UK Government have acknowledged that that's unsustainable because roughly a quarter of our electricity bills at the moment are made up of these levies. So that needs to change going forward. It needs to be a fairer system, and that's where carbon taxes can be looked at. But again, kind of repeat myself, but it's important that the most vulnerable are protected. Now, in wider industry as well, Mr Robertson, there needs to be cost-effective decarbonisation solutions available to industry when a carbon tax is introduced, and the taxation has got to be structured so it's fair and equitable across the UK. And one recent example I've got to consider is the UK Government have now opted to fast-track 2 carbon capture and storage clusters in the north of England, but disgracefully made the Scottish cluster a reserve cluster. So what this means is that despite the Scottish cluster being the most advanced in terms of project development and deliverability, it's also estimated to be the lowest cost cluster. The 2 other clusters will proceed at a faster rate. So therefore it would be inherently unfair for government support one way or another, either via direct taxation or through consumer levies, to help some industries in some areas of the country, but potentially a carbon tax slapped on another area just because they've not been progressed at the same rate. So these things do have to be looked at and around. Now, equally on that, if we look at the Scottish cluster, it takes in the 2 biggest carbon dioxide emitters in Scotland, Peterhead Gas Station and the NOS facilities at Grangemouth. So as the biggest polluters, they do have to pay to remedy that. So that's only right. But as I say, while they make that investment, they need that assistance, and it can't be done to disadvantage them where others are getting support. Also, again, just to reiterate, revenues from a carbon tax must be reinvested in green initiatives targeted at the most vulnerable and also the hardest sectors to decarbonise, but also must be completely transparent. We've had a carbon tax in the airline industry for years, effectively, air passenger duty, which is supposed to be that basic principle of the polluter pays, and that is in relation, or should be in relation to aircraft emissions. But the actual reality is the way PD's worked over the years, it's actually became nothing more than a government revenue stream. It's not ring-fenced for anything, it's not reinvested, it just becomes part of the money in column, and then it goes in the mix with government expenditure to go back out. So if you look at that, it's outrageous that over the years so-called environmental taxes have been levied and never ring-fenced and reinvested in the way that it should be to assist reducing the emissions. And of course, last week, Mr Robertson, the Chancellor, made the crazy announcement of lowering APD and domestic legs of return journeys. Now, as a minimum, we need to have a serious debate about support for the airline industry and the wider travel industry. But for me, if we're doing a reduction in air passenger duty, it should actually only maybe apply to, say, if it's airlines that are using sustainable sustainable aviation fuel, which actually costs more money. So at least if you're incentivising companies to lower their emissions, and then they get the offset reward and the reduced APD, it makes no sense in the current climate to actually just do a blanket APD cut. And then if you look at the aviation industry as a whole, for years, consecutive governments of different colours have maintained a policy that aviation fuel is duty-free. So we pay our petrol duties when we go to the petrol pump for domestic use in our cars, but yet all these years aviation fuel was duty-free. That makes no sense. And again, that needs to be looked at and around. I don't want to kick the airline industry when they're down, and don't want to make it harder for them. But we need to come up with a system that's fair for everybody if we're talking about carbon taxes, we're talking about emissions, and we're talking about incentivising behaviour to drive change. And that's something else that the government needs to look at. And then if you look at the oil and gas sector, there's been £350 billion of revenue that's came from Scotland over the years from the oil and gas sector. Effectively, these were carbon taxes as well. But again, that money's never been ring-fenced, it's never been reinvested, there's never been a sovereign wealth fund created. Most countries across the world have created sovereign wealth funds that they're now using in these tough times to either help their economy, stimulate their economy, or do green initiatives in the path to net zero. But the UK government has never done that, and that's to their shame that we don't have that money as a legacy to go forward. Just today, Mr Robertson, I managed to attend a COP26 panel event before I got on the train to come down here. And there was a representative there from Louisiana, and he was explaining how for years they've used their offshore revenues to actually pay for climate adaptation measures along their coastline, because obviously Louisiana is one of the areas most affected by coastal erosion. So it shows you what can be done in terms of long-term thinking, but it needs that initiative to look at revenues that are coming in and how you use them wisely. And again, that's my call for. If there's carbon taxation coming in, it must be transparent and must be available to be reused to fight climate change. Now also, in a similar vein, Mr Robertson, I represent a former coalfields area. Carbon taxes had been applied to the extraction of coal over the years. But yet, a few years ago, when the open cast coal industry collapsed in my constituency, it left massive craters that needed reinstatement at a cost of millions and millions of pounds. So again, carbon taxes came from my constituency, came to Treasury, just went in the black hole. When we asked for assistance for the restoration of these abandoned coal mines, the answer came, no, too bad, that money's come in, it's been used, there's no money coming back to your constituency, it doesn't work that way. So again, that shows the folly of not actually making a tax or ring-fencing the tax for what the purpose is it said it's ring-fenced for. So again, transparency is utterly critical if we go forward. And I'd also say, in terms of transparency, the Treasury is going to have to develop these taxes following open consultation with industry, with NGOs, with charities. And I'd also suggest that it would be worth the UK Government following the lead the Scottish Government and having a just transition commission that's able to advise the Government on fairness and look at policies across the board and advise the Government accordingly. And also, equally, Treasury cannot be left of the power to introduce exemptions on carbon taxes without robust and transparent procedures, or else you get into it's a lobbying exercise, and that becomes open season for donors and cronies to lobby the Government and possibly get their exemptions. So again, anything that comes forward needs to be transparent. And again, just one further warning about this not becoming a Treasury income, because, Mr Roberts, that's nearly happened post-Brexit. Bees had devised an emissions trading scheme, which was agreed with all the devolved nations, but then at the 11th hour, Treasury wanted to throw away all that work and replace it with introduction of a carbon tax. And that was clearly just because Treasury saw it as an income stream. So that cannot be allowed to happen. Treasury just cannot have carte blanche to do what it wants. But also it shows you carbon tax also have to be developed in conjunction and consultation with the devolved nations. Because let's face it, like Scotland, we've got our own net zero 2045 target. We've got, as I said, a Just Transition Commission. We're working our own policies, so therefore it would only be right that carbon taxes introduced have to be done in such a way that it doesn't adversely impact the direction of travel that we're on. So, getting near my conclusion, Mr Robertson, there are some concerns I've got about a carbon tax, but largely I do favour the concept. And I pay tribute to the work done with Zero Carbon Campaign, who they've illustrated and highlighted. Surveys prove that such a tax is actually generally popular with the wider public. They understand the need for net zero, they understand the benefits a carbon tax could be done, but again, the critical thing is it been done fairly. And the Scottish Climate Assembly has had similar findings with their delegates who have participated in the Assembly. So there are things that can be done to resolve these concerns, which is, again, about transparency. It's about the targeted reinvestment. Ireland's already doing this in terms of they target top-up social welfare payments. I think that's something the Government could look at, especially with the cost of living and the fuel energy cost crisis at the moment. Could put more money into supporting electric vehicles as we try to transfer from an internal combustion engine. And this is something that in Scotland, the Scottish Government do interest-free loans. They've extended interest-free loans to the second-hand market to try and extend that affordability. But at the moment, the UK Government's actually cutting grants available. So if we're going to have carbon taxes, we need to further stimulate the EV market and, again, make sure some people aren't left behind. And absolutely critical going forward is the decarbonisation of our heating systems. And actually, what would be really good would be if we stepped up the energy efficiency installations, treat energy efficiency as a critical infrastructure programme, speed up the rollout of the upgrade of getting all properties to EPC Band C. It reduces emissions, it reduces fuel costs, and what could be a fairer way of using carbon taxes that are levied. I'd agree with the two contributions so far about introducing a border carbon adjustment to minimise leakage or offshoring. We know carbon taxes can be successful in behaviour change. We know it does seem to have wider support if introduced fairly, and it's done in a transparent manner. So let's continue to have this serious discussion. Let's find a way to introduce it, but make sure that it's done in a way that helps us get to net zero, but it's done as part of a just transition.
Ina Pongasari.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Mr Robertson. Can I thank my honourable friend for Newcastle upon Tyne North for introducing this debate on behalf of the Petitions Committee. Can I also welcome the Minister in her place? This is the first time we've faced each other, and I look forward to debating on many other issues with her. I'd also like to thank the honourable member for Broadland, who talked passionately about climate crisis and made recommendations in terms of changes that need to take place. I found it really insightful. I'd also like to begin by making some general points about the government's approach to net zero, the role of the Treasury in this, and what Labour believes we should be doing differently. I will then come to make some specific points about carbon pricing and emissions trading scheme. As the Honourable Member for Newcastle upon Tyne North has said, this debate comes at a time when COP26 is taking place in Glasgow, which I think has affected the attendance at this debate. I would like to clearly state that Labour hopes that COP26 is a success. We have pointed out we do not believe that the government has done enough in the run-up, but for the sake of our planet and our future, we hope it is a success. A couple of weeks ago, the government published its long-awaited net zero strategy and the company Treasury net zero review. We do welcome the fact that the government has published a detailed strategy for reaching net zero, but we do have some concerns in terms of the fact that there are some flaws, serious flaws within the strategy and the government's overall approach on this. For the first, the strategy doesn't really go far further enough to close the gap between the government's promises and delivery. In too many areas, there are issues with heat pumps, hydrogen, electric vehicle infrastructure, heavy industry and carbon capture and storage. And we're not really seeing from the government credible plans that match the scale of the ambition that is needed for this. Secondly, the strategy does undermine the total failure to provide investment that is needed. And I have to say that we do feel that this blame falls squarely with the Treasury and the Chancellor. One of the things is the Treasury's net zero review argued against borrowing to invest in the net zero transition, as this would deviate from polluting pays principles and not be consistent with the intergenerational fairness. This is extraordinary and it is an extremely worrying statement. And it precisely for future generations who will benefit from a green transition, from cleaner air and future jobs and jobs of the future. And we have to say that there is a failure to act on this, and it will be unfair on legacy to leave this to future generations. So I do hope the Minister will reconsider this statement. It is also quite staggering that last week's budget, the Chancellor did not use the word climate once, and on the single biggest issue that is facing the planet, the Chancellor has said nothing on this. And also when we look in detail at the budget, we can see why, because in the budget there, it failed to take the decisive action that was needed on climate change. The budget had no plan for economic growth, and it certainly had no plan to invest at scale in the transition to zero carbon economy. By contrast, the Shadow Chancellor has set out Labour's climate investment pledge, and that is 28 billion of green capital investment each and every year for the rest of the decade. And what that would do, it will go towards critical sectors such as retrofitting, insulating 90 million homes, bringing down energy bills in the process, and helping industries such as steel to make the transition and keep the good jobs which so many communities rely on. And unlike the government, we're not going to leave households and businesses to face the costs of net zero transition on their own. And this has been welcomed by a number of environmental and business groups as a serious offer which meets the scale of the challenge. Indeed, business groups and others know the cost of inaction is far greater than the cost of action. Just last week, the Office of Budget Responsibility said that the government's failure to set out a clear plan for apportioning net zero costs between businesses, households and government is a source of long-term fiasco risk. And also, we do feel to be a responsible Chancellor, you must be a Green Chancellor, and I'm afraid our current Chancellor isn't simply either. In fact, one of the major announcements in the budget was to cut domestic air passenger duty, and this has been mentioned by the Honourable Member already. We are talking today about the price of carbon, yet the Chancellor is cutting duty on domestic air travel, which produces significant emissions, whilst failing to invest properly in rail travel. I mean, this isn't a choice that Labour would have made, and it is quite baffling that this decision was made. I now wish to make a few points about the UK's emissions trading scheme. In the government's response to the petition we are considering today, they say the UK has now launched its own emissions trading system to replace membership of the EU ETS. This will be the world's first net zero cap and trade market, delivering a robust carbon price signal and promoting cost-effective decarbonisation by allowing businesses to cut carbon where it's cheapest to do so. This is something we support in principle, but I do have a number of questions for the Minister about how the ETS is operating and what plans the government has for its development. So first, the Minister will know that 2/3 of emissions are not currently covered by UK ETS. Will she update us on what plans the government has to expand it into more sectors? Second, the government has previously stated that it's open to linking UK ETS with other international schemes. Has the government made any progress with that? In particular, is the government in discussion with the EU about linking it with the ETS? Third, there's also been concerns about the stability of the UK ETS, given its relatively small size. Can the Minister tell us how market is functioning in this regard and whether the government consider any changes as are required? And finally, can the government tell us what further plans it has for carbon pricing policy? The Treasury's net zero review does leave us with many big questions unanswered, which includes how costs will be rebalanced from electricity to gas, the future of vehicles and fuel taxes, and where new sources of revenue will come from. To conclude, Mr Robinson, we do need the Treasury and the Chancellor to get serious about our net zero transition. We do need to end the delay and to end to insufficient investment. We need a plan that needs to be backed by funding to help us meet our moral obligations to the planet and to the future generations. I have to say anything less is simply not good enough. Thank you, Mr Robinson.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr Robinson. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and may I begin, as many other members have done, in recognising that today is a significant day for international efforts to tackle climate change, and I suspect, like other honourable members, that is why this debate, which I would expect to have been extremely full, is a little sparser than that expectation, because I'm sure all those who would have wanted to attend today are indeed debating this very issue in Glasgow. And I would like to thank and recognise and congratulate the more than 100,000 petitioners for securing this debate on an important subject. And I don't think there's any disagreement amongst members here today across the House that this is an absolutely fundamental issue that we here in the UK, as well as others across the world, need to address. As the Prime Minister said at the G20 meetings yesterday, if we don't act right now, the Paris Agreement will be looked at in the future not as the moment humanity opened its eyes to the problem, but the moment we flinched and turned away. I can't, of course, preempt the outcome of discussions in Glasgow, but what I can do and want to do is to repeat for the record that the government is absolutely focused on tackling climate change, and we are taking action on a number of different fronts. As the hosts of COP26, we've been determined to promote ambitious action to deliver the urgent transformational changes that are required by the Paris Agreement. And we're also seeking to play our own part, as any responsible nation should. I'm sure honourable members know, but between 1990 and 2019, the UK reduced its greenhouse gas emissions by 44%, compared to 5% for the G7 as a whole. And since the year 2000, the UK has reduced emissions faster than any other country in the G20. So now, Mr Robertson, I'd like to turn to the subject of and the specifics of the petition and some of the points that honourable members have raised. I was very grateful for the honourable member for Erith and Thamesmead for recognising the importance of the government's net zero strategy, which sets out the plan to reduce our emissions. And in that strategy, we outlined measures to transition to a green and sustainable future. And as the honourable member for Broadland recognised, we can't reach net zero by government action alone. And what the plan does is leverage up to £90 billion of private investment by 2030 and confirms £26 billion of public capital investment since the 10-point plan. This investment and the package of policies in the net zero strategy will keep the UK on track to meet its carbon budgets and our 2030 nationally determined contribution and reach net zero by 2050. And in doing this, we will lay the foundations for a clean and resilient energy supply by investing in wind, investing in nuclear and carbon capture and storage, as well as accelerating decarbonisation in sectors such as transport and buildings. The honourable member for Thamesmead talked about funding, and she suggested that it wasn't enough. But I would just like to reiterate the commitment to a total of £30 billion of domestic investment for the green industrial revolution from 2021 to 2022. She also suggested that the Chancellor was not doing enough. But, Mr Robertson, the Chancellor is leading on COP26 in terms of liaising with other finance ministers on the subject. And what we will see is a £100 billion investment by a variety of companies to support developing countries reduce carbon emissions in their own countries by 2023. And we expect to exceed that investment of $100 billion between 2023 and 2025. The Prime Minister is obviously also leading the work at COP26. Now, a key part of the debate today has been about carbon pricing. Most members talked about that, and this petition specifically calls for a carbon charge to encourage industries and organisations to reduce their carbon emissions. The 2020 Energy White Paper set out our aspirations to continue to lead the world on carbon pricing in the run-up to COP26 and beyond. The government believes that carbon pricing is indeed one of the most efficient tools of decarbonisation and has a key role to play in helping the UK achieve net zero emissions by 2050, which is why we've committed to maintaining an ambitious carbon price, ensuring in turn that those who pollute with their emissions pay for those emissions. The UK already has two carbon pricing policies, the Carbon Price Support, or the CPS, and the UK Emissions Trading Scheme. Honourable members will know that the Carbon Price Support rate is a tax on fossil fuels used in electricity generation. And since the CPS rates were introduced in 2013, they've contributed to a fall in coal use for electricity generation. Electricity generated from coal fell by 40% in 2012, prior to the CPS, to just 5% in 2018. The UK also launched its own emissions trading scheme at the beginning of the year, covering a third of UK emissions. And what that does is applies a carbon price to the power, industrial and aviation sectors. And we have committed to exploring and expanding the UK ETS to other sectors too. The ETS works on the cap and trade principle by setting a cap on the total amount of certain greenhouse gases that can be emitted by covered sectors. Companies in covered sectors must obtain and surrender sufficient carbon allowances to cover their emissions. The honourable members for Broadlands, Newcastle upon Tyne North and Erith and Thamesmead highlighted that this scheme at the moment only covers a third of those emissions and asked what more we were going to do. And I'd like to reiterate, Mr Robinson, that we have committed to exploring expanding that scheme to the two-thirds of emissions that are not currently covered. I was also asked, Mr Robertson, when by the honourable member for Newcastle upon Tyne North, when we will review the carbon price trajectory in the ETS. And I want to reassure her that we do remain committed and intend to bring forward a consultation in the coming months. And that commitment was reiterated in our net zero strategy. Mr Robertson, the other point that came up a number of times was the recommendation that the government should introduce a carbon border adjustments. It was a point made by the honourable member for Newcastle upon Tyne North and the honourable member for Broadlands. And I want to reassure those members that we are following developments on the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism very closely. And as COP and G7 president, our instinct is obviously that we need to work together with our international partners on how to tackle climate change. And we're continually assessing a range of options on this issue. I'm very happy to give way.
And apologise for pushing on this, because I can see she doesn't have a clearer response, because in the coming months is as vague as the timings that we're already being notified of. And I wondered if she could either give a more clear picture of the kind of timescale we're talking about, or a reason why there is no clear timescale for this being achieved.
Well, I thank the honourable member, and I recognise and don't expect anything less than her to push me on the subject of timing. But at the moment, all I can say is that we will be bringing it forward in the coming months, and I'm very, very happy to keep her updated about that timing as we progress. I'm very happy to give way.
I won't push her again on that, because I can see she doesn't have a clearer time frame, but obviously it's of very keen interest to those that are following this debate. The other issue I wanted to flag from the comments she has made so far is that she's made no reference to ensuring that it's a just and equitable transition. So obviously polluters pay, and we don't just expect consumers to continue paying more and more to enable this net zero transition. And I wondered if she just hasn't got to those comments yet, or if there's something she can say to assure us that the government is looking to spread the cost as well as the responsibility for reducing for meeting our net zero targets.
Well, I thank the honourable member, and the schemes that we already have in place obviously are schemes where polluter pays. You know, the two schemes that we have in operation are about industry recognising that when they pollute, they must pay for that. And we did, the honourable member, as well as the honourable member for Kilmarnock and Loudon, talked about individuals and what the government could do to support individuals, and the issue of heat pumps has been raised on two occasions, and obviously the importance of measures such as these are not being too burdensome on those who need to implement them. And I would just like to reiterate, although I know a number of ministers have made this point very clearly, we're not forcing people to take measures, for example, install heat pumps. What we're saying is if they wish to do so, there is a grant available to them. And on the heat pumps in particular, would just like to make clear what we expect to happen is that the price will come down. And I suspect that that will happen when we have a requirement for all new homes to be net zero by 2025, when there is the volume of supply of heat pumps. I suspect at that stage the price of these will come down, as we have seen, for example, in relation to electric cars and other matters. Yes, very happy to give way.
To give way at that point. My understanding is it's not the price of the product that will go down, because France is already installing 400,000 heat pumps already. So there is volume in production. What's interesting is the mechanism of installation. When you get the big suppliers, the electricity suppliers, starting to install, rather like British Gas does with boilers today, that's where the prices will really come down.
Well, I'm very grateful for that point for the honourable gentleman. I do hope as well as the installation, that the prices will fall as well. It's very interesting intervention. Very happy to give way.
Being very generous. I'm sure she appreciates that it is obviously important that the polluter pays, but the polluter, many businesses, will pass that cost on to consumers. And I think we need to be really transparent about where those costs are going to land. And I would hope that the government is going to take steps to ensure that we don't push people further into fuel poverty, that if we're installing heat pumps, that we help people to insulate their homes, that there is a lot that the government can do to make sure that the poorest don't pay, even if it's by the back door.
I can assure the honourable member that as we bring in policies, I know in my area and I'm responsible for tax, we are always very conscious of whether the prices are going to be passed down to consumers. And she will know we already have a number of mechanisms where we do protect those on the lowest incomes in terms of, for example, energy costs, the warm homes discount, the energy price cap. So, of course, we are conscious that we don't just want costs to be passed down. I think I'm just going to make a little bit of progress of the... and I am about to address a point that the Honourable Member for Kilmarnock and Loudon mentioned, because he mentioned aviation duty. And I would just like to make the point on aviation duty. The point has been made about the domestic increase in air passenger duty over the last few days. But I would like to highlight some other work that is being done in this industry to try and ensure that airlines bring that we make sure that this industry is compliant with our net zero targets and ambitions. And we have the Jet Zero Council, who is looking at how do we revolutionise this industry and make it more carbon neutral. I'd just like to, oh, very, very well, very happy to take an intervention.
I covered Jet Zero Council, but what measures are in the budget then to help the airline industry decarbonise?
The budget, Mr Robertson, was one measure to ensure that set out a number of measures to ensure that we had decarbonisation. There was a significant amount of spending in relation to the decarbonisation in various transport areas, electrification of cars. We've also already talked about heat pumps. And in relation to the airline industry, the Honourable Member will remember that as well as reducing the tax in relation to domestic airlines, we actually increased the tax on long-haul flights. So recognising that if you do travel further, then that isn't particularly carbon friendly. Mr Robertson, I'd just like to address two things, because they weren't particularly raised in the debate, but they were in the petition, and they are important. The petition made the link between air quality and subsidies to fossil fuel companies, and I just wanted to highlight that the UK has been a long-standing supporter of multilateral efforts to promote fossil fuel subsidy reform since these were first proposed in 2009, including through the G7 and the G20. And in December 2020, the UK announced its support for the statement on global fossil fuel subsidy reform, because we believe that inefficient fossil fuel subsidies encourage wasteful consumption, reduce our energy security, impede investment in clean energy resources and undermine efforts to deal with the threat of climate change. And in March of this year, the government went further to confirm that the UK will no longer provide new direct financial or promotional support for the fossil fuel energy sector overseas, other than in tightly defined and limited circumstances, such as technical or regulatory assistance that supports health and safety or to support decommissioning. And the other matter, Mr Robertson, that was raised in the petition was an important area, which is about air quality. And I just wanted to underline that the government is also taking significant steps to improve air quality in the UK. And it's not just tax measures, but non-tax measures that achieve the most. And that's why we have a strong, proportionate regulatory framework in place, which requires industry to reduce emissions, including carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxide and particulate matter. And they've responded with investment and innovation to meet these standards. So, Mr Robertson, I'd like to conclude by saying this it's a pleasure for the government to answer on this extremely important topic today. And the success of the petitioners in securing a debate such as this shouldn't come as a surprise to any of us. It's just simply evidence of the widespread recognition of the challenge we face, the importance of this issue and the cross-party support for tackling climate change. As the Prime Minister said yesterday, the UK has proved it can be done. We've lowered our greenhouse gas emissions by 44%, and we're cutting our contribution to climate change more and more every day. And I would like to reassure honourable members and the thousands of petitioners that the government takes this issue extremely seriously, and we will continue to act on many fronts, both nationally and internationally.
Catherine Mckinnell to wind up.
Thank you, Mr Robertson. And I thank the Minister for that response and being very generous in taking interventions. And I think just to conclude this debate, what it's highlighted for me in particular is the need to be upfront and transparent about the costs, about the benefits, and about the trade-offs that will need to be made on the road to net zero. The Prime Minister said we're at 1 minute to midnight on climate change. We all know we have to change the way we live. We know that we'll need to change the way we do business, but that process is made so much harder by how confusing and opaque much of what is happening is, and it's very difficult to work out what the right thing to do is, particularly for consumers, but I think the landscape is also very confusing for businesses at the moment. So we need much more transparency about the sources of carbon emissions. We do need to ensure polluters pay, but we need to make sure that doesn't just become words. We need to see it as action, and we need to end the absurd situation where choosing to be climate conscious as consumers ends up costing us more, which drives poor decision making and more carbon intensive behaviour that most of us would rather, well, all of us would rather avoid, and that we need to avoid. So the net zero review recognises the impact and that it won't fall equally. So that's where the government really needs to step up and be upfront about who the winners and the losers are going to be from this transition. And we need to put in place the steps now to mitigate that impact. Not only to make sure that the transition is fair and equitable, but that it has the buy-in from everybody, because the impact we all benefit from and we all contribute towards getting us to that end. So we know the world is watching. We know we're waiting for this historic agreement in Glasgow, and leaders both at home and abroad, I think, know that it's time now to turn meaningful words into real action.
The question is that this House has considered E-petition 574678 relating to charges on carbon emissions. As many of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. The sitting stands adjourned.
Proceeding has ended.